When officials slapped a condemnation notice on the Cliffside cabin, everyone expected the elderly couple to leave quietly. But what they found hidden in the walls would expose a 70-year cover-up and change their lives forever. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The morning mist clung to Pine Bluff like a secret refusing to be told. Merrick stood on the weathered deck of his cabin, calloused hands wrapped around a chipped coffee mug, staring out at the valley below. At 73 years old, he'd learned to read the mountains the way some men read newspapers. Every ridgeline, every shadow had meaning. And this morning, something felt wrong. The air carried weight it shouldn't. Behind him, through the screen door, he could hear Opal humming while she made breakfast. After 49 years of marriage, her voice still settled something restless in his chest. She was 71 now, silver hair pulled back in the same practical bun she'd worn since her librarian days, reading glasses perpetually perched on her nose. They'd retired to this place 30 years ago when the world still made sense, when a fixed income could stretch, when nobody bothered you if you paid your taxes and kept to yourself. The cabin itself wasn't much to look at. Rough-hewn logs darkened by decades of weather, a stone chimney that leaked smoke when the wind blew wrong, windows that rattled in their frames. But it was theirs. Perched on the edge of the cliff overlooking what locals called the Ridgemont Valley, it offered a view that stopped hearts and started conversations. On clear days, you could see for 30 miles. Merrick had bought the property for almost nothing back in 1994. Nobody else wanted it. Too remote, too run down, too close to the edge. The real estate agent had practically begged him to reconsider. But Merrick, who'd spent 40 years as a civil engineer building bridges that didn't fall and roads that didn't crack, he knew solid construction when he saw it. The cabin had good bones. And the price, $8,000, was something he and Opal could actually afford on their combined pensions. They'd made it home, patched the roof, replaced rotted boards, reinforced the foundation. Opal planted wildflowers that now bloomed every spring in defiant bursts of color against the rocky soil. Merrick built the deck extension himself, each nail driven with the precision of a man who understood that shortcuts kill. Their nearest neighbor was 4 miles down the mountain road. The small town of Ridgemont, population 2,300, sat another 6 miles beyond that. It was isolated, sure, but isolation felt like peace when you'd spent your whole life surrounded by noise. Merrick took another sip of coffee, now gone cold, and watched a hawk circle below the cliff edge. That's when he saw the dust trail on the access road. A vehicle, moving fast, kicking up gravel and intention. His stomach tightened. They didn't get visitors. Not up here. Not unannounced. "Opal," he called through the screen door. "We got company." She appeared beside him moments later, wiping her hands on a dish towel, squinting against the morning sun. "Who'd be coming up here this early?" "Don't know," Merrick said quietly, "but I got a feeling we're about to find out." The vehicle rounded the final bend, a white county truck with official seals on the doors. It pulled into their small clearing and stopped, engine ticking as it cooled. 2 men stepped out. The first was younger, maybe 40, wearing khakis and a button-down shirt with a county badge clipped to his belt. He carried a leather folder like it was a weapon. The second man was older, 60s, wearing a hard hat that seemed performative, unnecessary. His boots were too clean for someone who actually worked. The younger man approached first, his smile tight and practiced. "Mr. and Mrs. Holbrook?" "That's us," Merrick said, not moving from the deck. Opal's hand found his elbow, a gentle pressure that meant steady. "I'm Dalton Voss, County Building Inspector. This is Jerry Kramer, Structural Engineer. We need to talk to you about your property." Merrick felt Opal's fingers tighten. "What about it?" Voss opened his leather folder, pulled out a sheaf of papers. "I'm afraid we've identified serious structural deficiencies in your residence. The foundation is compromised, the cliff face is unstable, and continuing to occupy this structure poses an immediate danger to your safety. Merrick blinked. Excuse me, we're issuing a formal condemnation notice, Voss continued, holding up an official-looking document with the county seal stamped in red ink. You have 60 days to vacate the premises. After that, the structure will be demolished for public safety. The words hit like stones. Opal made a small sound, almost a gasp. Merrick's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. Now hold on, he said, his voice low and controlled. I've lived here 30 years. I'm a civil engineer. I know this structure. There's nothing wrong with the foundation. Voss's smile never wavered. With all due respect, Mr. Holbrook, the county has conducted its own assessment. The evidence is clear. What evidence? Merrick stepped down from the deck, moving closer. Show me the survey. Show me the soil tests. Show me the engineering report that says my home is unsafe. The engineer, Kramer, stepped forward. The cliff face has experienced significant erosion. We've documented cracking in the bedrock. Your cabin sits approximately 12 feet from the edge. One good storm, one seismic event, and this whole structure goes over. I've weathered every storm for 3 decades, Merrick said, including the earthquake of 2009. Not a single crack in my walls. Voss tucked the papers back into his folder. I understand this is difficult, but the decision has been made. The county is prepared to offer relocation assistance, $3,000 to help with moving expenses. $3,000, Opal finally spoke, her voice shaking. You want us to leave our home for $3,000? It's a generous offer, Voss said, and his tone suggested the conversation was over. You have 60 days. I suggest you start making arrangements. They left the same way they came, fast and final, dust settling behind them like a period at the end of a sentence Merrick didn't get to write. He stood in the clearing long after the truck disappeared, fists clenched, breathing hard. Opal moved beside him, her shoulder against his arm. They can't do this, she whispered. Can they? Merrick looked at their cabin, at the deck where they'd watched 1,000 sunsets, at the flower boxes Opal tended with arthritic hands, at the life they'd built from nothing. I don't know, he said honestly, but I'm damn sure going to find out. That night, neither of them slept well. Merrick lay in bed staring at the ceiling beams he'd reinforced himself in 1997, listening to the cabin settle and creak the way old structures do, sounds he'd long ago learned to distinguish between normal and concerning. There was nothing concerning. The foundation was solid, the walls were plumb. He'd stake his professional reputation on it, except his reputation didn't seem to matter to the county. Beside him, Opal shifted restlessly. In the darkness, her voice came soft and afraid. What are we going to do? Merrick reached for her hand. Fight, he said simply. We're going to fight. By morning, he had a plan. While Opal made phone calls to friends who might know lawyers, Merrick grabbed his old surveying equipment from the shed, equipment he hadn't touched in 15 years but had maintained out of habit. He spent the morning walking the perimeter of their property, shooting grades, checking measurements, documenting everything. The cliff edge was stable. The bedrock showed no signs of new fracturing. If anything, the erosion was less severe than it had been when they first bought the place. He'd actually reinforced several areas with concrete and rebar back in 2003. None of it made sense. Why now? Why, after 30 years of the county ignoring this property completely, were they suddenly desperate to condemn it? Opal returned from town that afternoon with more questions than answers. She'd spent 4 hours at the county clerk's office, pulling property records, reading through dusty file boxes that looked like they hadn't been opened since the Reagan administration. What she found made the hair on Merrick's neck stand up. Their property, the 12 acres of cliffside land they'd bought for $8,000 in 1994, had changed hands 17 times between 1946 and 1993. 17 times. Most properties that old had maybe 3 or 4 transfers. But this land, it was like nobody could hold onto it, or didn't want to. More disturbing, Opal had found inconsistencies in the deed records. Names that appeared on one document but not another. Sale prices that made no sense. $100 for 12 acres of prime mountain land in 1962. And strangest of all, a gap in the records from 1946 to 1951. 5 years where the property seemed to exist in legal limbo, owned by no one, or owned by someone whose name had been carefully erased. Merrick spread the photocopies across their kitchen table, his reading glasses sliding down his nose as he studied each page. "Something happened here," he murmured. "Something they don't want anyone remembering." But what? Opal sat across from him, her librarian instincts fully engaged. She'd organized the documents chronologically, cross-referenced names, even started a hand-drawn timeline on graph paper. "And look at this," she pointed to a surveyor's map from 1947. "See how the property line is drawn? It extends another 40 feet past where our deed says it ends." Merrick leaned closer. "That's not a surveying error. That's intentional. But why redraw the lines? Why make the property smaller? Unless," Merrick said slowly, "there was something on those 40 feet they didn't want included in future sales." The next morning, a Saturday, Merrick started in the crawl space. If there were secrets buried in this property, structural secrets, they'd most likely be in the foundation. He'd inspected it dozens of times over the years during routine maintenance, but he'd never looked for anything hidden. Now he crawled through the dim space with a powerful flashlight, examining every stone, every support beam, every corner. It was Opal who found the first real clue, not in the crawl space, but inside the cabin itself. She'd been cleaning the stone fireplace, a twice-yearly ritual she performed with the thoroughness of someone who'd spent her life organizing library archives. She was scrubbing the mantel when her cloth caught on something, a small irregularity in the stone. "Merrick," she called, "come look at this." He emerged from the crawl space, dusty and cobwebbed, to find her running her fingers along the fireplace's inner wall. "Feel this," she said. He pressed his palm against the stone where she indicated. It was cool, solid, but when he tapped it with his knuckle, the sound was wrong. Hollow. "There's a space behind here," he said. His heart started hammering the way it used to before a big project, that mix of anxiety and excitement that came with discovering something unexpected. He retrieved a pry bar from his tool shed and began carefully working at the mortar around the irregular stones. Opal brought him a headlamp, a glass of water he forgot to drink, and her steady presence. It took 3 hours of patient work. The stones had been placed with incredible precision, designed to look like part of the original fireplace, but actually concealing a hollow cavity about 2 feet wide and 3 feet deep. When the final stone came free, Merrick reached inside. His fingers touched metal, cold, smooth, deliberate. He pulled out a box, military issue from the looks of it, olive drab paint now faded to grey, latches rusted but still functional. Opal gasped. Merrick carried it to the kitchen table, the same table where they'd spread out the confusing property records, and set it down with reverence. The box wasn't locked, but the lid resisted, sealed by decades of moisture and neglect. When it finally opened, the smell of old paper and mildew filled the room. Inside were letters, dozens of them, tied with string that disintegrated at his touch. Beneath the letters, wrapped in oilcloth, were documents, and at the very bottom, folded into a careful square, a map. Opal reached for the first letter with trembling hands. The envelope was addressed to Sterling Thatcher, General Delivery, Ridgemont. The return address simply said Emmeline, Clearwater Valley. The postmark read July 14th, 1946. She opened it carefully. The paper crackled, fragile as old skin. The handwriting was elegant, educated, the kind taught in schools that no longer existed. She read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dearest Sterling, I pray this letter finds you well in Billings. The situation here grows more dire each day. The government men came again yesterday with their maps and their promises. They say the dam will bring prosperity, but we know better. They're offering pennies for land our families have held for generations. Mother refuses to sell, as do the Harrisons and the Becketts. But I fear we are fighting a battle already lost. If they force us out, and I believe they will, we must preserve what we can. You remember the repository we discussed? I've begun the work. Thomas and I have been moving items under cover of darkness. The location is perfect, hidden, protected by the cliff itself. When you return, I'll show you. But if something happens to me, if I cannot return after the relocation, the map will guide you. Trust no one in the county office. They've been paid to forget. With love always, your sister Emmeline. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the wall clock Merrick had fixed in 2012. Opal looked up at her husband, eyes wide. "The Clearwater Valley," she breathed. "Merrick, the Clearwater Valley." He knew the name. Everyone in this part of the state knew it. Clearwater Valley had been a thriving community of 800 people until 1948, when the federal government dammed the Clearwater River, creating the reservoir that now supplied water to 3 counties. The entire valley had been flooded. The town gone, submerged under 200 feet of water. The residents had been relocated, compensated, scattered to the winds. It was history, settled history, something that happened before most people alive today were even born. Except apparently it wasn't settled at all. Merrick reached for the map. It was hand-drawn, precise, showing topographical features he recognized. The cliff, the ridge, their property, and marked with small X's, a trail of locations circling their cabin. At the center, where their fireplace now stood, someone had written in careful script, "The repository." Opal pulled out more letters. They painted a picture of systematic displacement, of government officials who made promises they never intended to keep, of families offered compensation so inadequate it was insulting. Emmeline's letters grew increasingly desperate as 1947 turned to 1948. In her final letter, dated March 2, 1948, she wrote about finish work, about sealing the repository, about saying goodbye to the only home she'd ever known. There were other documents in the box, receipts for construction materials purchased in 1946 and 47, sketches of what looked like underground storage, a list of names, families from Clearwater Valley beside each name, notations like sterling silver set, deed to land parcel 7, gold coins from grandfather's estate, stocks and bonds. Merrick sat back in his chair, the implications washing over him. Before they were forced out, before the valley flooded, someone, this Emmeline Thatcher, had hidden the community's valuables. And she'd hidden them here, on this property, probably under this very cabin. "That's why the property changed hands so many times," Opal said, her mind working through the puzzle. People were looking for it. The government, or whoever knew about the repository, they were trying to find it. "But why give up?" Merrick asked. "Why stop looking?" Opal pulled out the final document from the box. It was a death certificate. Emmeline Louise Thatcher died April 16, 1948, age 34. Cause of death: drowning. Merrick felt cold. She died before she could tell anyone where it was hidden. Or someone made sure she couldn't tell, Opal said quietly. They sat together as the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, transforming their modest kitchen into something that felt suddenly significant, historical. The cabin they'd bought for almost nothing, the property everyone else had abandoned, it wasn't worthless at all. It was a vault, and they'd been living on top of it for 30 years without knowing. "Now hold on," Merrick said, his engineer's mind demanding logic. "We don't know for sure there's anything still here. This was 70-plus years ago. Someone might have found it already." "Then why condemn our cabin now?" Opal countered. "Why, after all these years, is the county suddenly desperate to demolish our home?" Merrick had no answer for that. but he knew who might. He stood up, grabbed his keys. "Where are you going?" Opal asked. "To make some calls," he said, "and to find out who Dalton Voss really works for." While Merrick spent the evening on the phone with old colleagues from his engineering days, calling in favors, asking questions about county building inspectors and convenient condemnations, Opal returned to the map. She spread it across their bed, weighing down the corners with books, and studied every mark, every notation. The X's formed a pattern. They started at the cliff edge, moved inland in a spiral, and converged at the cabin's center. She remembered her surveying courses from library school, how to read topographical maps, how to understand elevation markers. These weren't random marks. They were waypoints, a trail designed to be followed. She found Merrick's old surveying equipment in the spare room, equipment he'd kept pristine even in retirement. The transit level, the measuring chains, the stakes. If the map was accurate, and she had no reason to believe it wasn't, then each X marked a specific location. But what was at those locations? Merrick returned near midnight, his face grim. "What did you find out?" Opal asked. "Dalton Voss has been county building inspector for 11 years, Merrick said. But here's the interesting part. His grandfather, Raymond Voss, was assistant director of the Clearwater Dam project in 1947 and 48. Opal felt her stomach drop. "It's not a coincidence." "No," Merrick agreed. "It's not. And there's more. I called Tommy Webster. You remember him? Worked in the county assessor's office until he retired. He said there's been unusual activity around our property records in the past 6 months. Someone's been pulling files, making inquiries. And 3 months ago, the county suddenly ordered a structural survey of all properties within 5 miles of the old Clearwater Valley flood zone." "But why now?" Opal asked. "Why, after 77 years, are they suddenly interested?" Merrick pulled out his phone, showed her a news article he'd found. It was from a Denver paper dated 4 months ago. The headline read, "Clearwater Dam Decommissioning Study Begins." He scrolled down. "They're considering draining the reservoir. Environmental concerns, maintenance costs, changing water needs. The study will take 2 years, but if they drain it, the old valley will be exposed. And if the valley is exposed," Opal said, understanding dawning, "then people might start looking for what was left behind. Families might come back. Archaeologists, historians, treasure hunters. And if there's a repository of valuables hidden somewhere near the flood zone," Merrick continued, "then certain people might want to make sure they control that location before anyone else starts asking questions." "That's why they want us gone," Opal breathed. "They know something's here, or they suspect it, and they need access to our property before the dam study goes public." Merrick nodded slowly. "And they're willing to use county resources, abuse their authority to get it." They stood together in their small bedroom, the map spread before them, the letters from a dead woman stacked on the nightstand, and the weight of 77 years of buried history pressing down on their shoulders. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows the way it always did before a storm. The cabin creaked and settled, solid, unmovable. What happens next will turn this night upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Merrick made a decision then. "We follow the map," he said. "Tomorrow we start at the first marker and we see what Emmeline Thatcher wanted us to find." "But Merrick," Opal said carefully, "what if it's dangerous? What if that's why she died?" "Then we're careful," he replied. "But I'll be damned if I'm going to let Dalton Voss and his corrupt grandfather's legacy take our home without a fight. If there's something on this property worth hiding for 77 years, then it belongs to the people they stole it from, the families of Clearwater Valley, not the government that displaced them." Opal looked at her husband, this man she'd married 49 years ago, who'd built her a life with his hands and his integrity. and she saw something she hadn't seen in a long time. Fire. Purpose. The same determination he'd had when he was younger, when he fought city councils to build safer bridges and argued with contractors who cut corners. He'd spent his career making sure things were built right. Now he was going to make sure a wrong was set right. "I'm with you," she said simply. That night they didn't sleep. Instead, they planned. Merrick sketched out a grid of their property, overlaying Emmeline's map with modern landmarks. Opal made lists, equipment they'd need, people they might trust, precautions they should take. If Voss or his people were watching, and they had to assume they were, then they needed to be smart about this. By dawn, they had a strategy. They'd start with the perimeter markers, working their way inward, making it look like routine property maintenance. Merrick would be surveying for his own structural assessment, gathering evidence to fight the condemnation. No one needed to know they were actually following a 77-year-old treasure map. The first marker, according to Emmeline's map, should be approximately 160 feet northeast of the cabin, near a distinctive rock formation Opal had always called the Turtle because of its shape. They headed out just after sunrise, Merrick carrying his transit level and measurement tools, Opal with a notebook and camera, documenting everything the way a good librarian would. The morning was crisp, clear, the kind of late summer day that reminded you why people fell in love with mountains in the first place. They reached the Turtle Rock in 15 minutes, and Merrick set up his equipment while Opal examined the ground. The map showed the marker should be buried, something about 3 feet down, marked with a stone bearing a specific symbol. Merrick began measuring, calling out numbers Opal recorded. To anyone watching from a distance, they looked like exactly what they were pretending to be, an elderly couple conducting a property survey. But Opal's eyes were scanning the ground, looking for disturbed soil, unusual stone placement, anything that suggested human intervention decades ago. "There," Merrick said suddenly. He pointed to a flat stone partially covered by moss and pine needles. The stone was larger than the others around it, and when Opal brushed away the debris, she gasped. Carved into the surface, worn but still visible, was a symbol. A compass rose with the letter T in the center. "T for Thatcher," Opal whispered. They dug carefully. The soil was rocky but not impossible. At exactly 2 feet 11 inches, Merrick's shovel struck something solid. Metal. They cleared the dirt away to reveal a small waterproof container, military surplus like the box from the fireplace. Inside was another letter from Emmeline, dated August 3, 1947. This one was different, not sentimental, but instructional. Precise directions to the next marker, a list of what had been placed in each cache. Gold coins here, sterling silver there, important documents sealed in the third location. And at the end, a warning. If you're following this path, then you know the truth. The government men promised compensation they never delivered. They promised to preserve our history and culture, but they lied. What we've hidden here belongs to the families of Clearwater Valley. Protect it. Honor it. Never let them erase us completely. Merrick read the words twice, his jaw clenched. Opal wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. They spent 6 hours that day following Emmeline's trail. Each marker led to the next. Each cache held pieces of a community's life, things too precious to abandon, but too valuable to trust to government promises. By sunset, they'd located 4 markers. They hadn't opened all of them, hadn't taken anything, just confirmed they were there and photographed their locations. That evening, as they compared notes at the kitchen table, Opal pulled up something on her laptop. "I've been researching the Clearwater Valley families," she said. "There's a historical society in Billings, Montana. They have archives, and look at this." She turned the screen toward Merrick. It was a photograph from 1947, showing residents of Clearwater Valley gathered outside a white church. In the front row stood a woman in her 30s with intelligent eyes and determined expression. The caption read, "Emmeline Thatcher, schoolteacher and community organizer, leads protest against inadequate dam compensation. That's her, Opal said softly. That's the woman who wrote these letters, who hid all of this, who died trying to save her community's legacy. Merrick stared at the photograph. She looks like someone who doesn't give up. She didn't, Opal agreed, and neither will we. But their resolve was tested the very next morning when they found fresh tire tracks in their driveway. Someone had been on their property during the night. The tracks led to the Turtle Rock area, stopped, then backed out. Whoever it was, they'd been looking, maybe watching, maybe searching. Merrick called the county sheriff's office. The deputy who answered was polite but unhelpful. Probably just teenagers, he said. Lots of kids drive up there to drink beer and watch the sunrise. Unless something was stolen or damaged, wasn't much they could do. When Merrick hung up, Opal was standing at the window, arms crossed. They know we're looking for something. Then we'd better find it before they do, Merrick said. They spent the next 3 days moving with purpose disguised as routine. Merrick would take his coffee on the deck each morning, scanning the access road for unwanted visitors, while Opal catalogued the letters by date, cross-referencing names and locations. What had started as a mystery was becoming something larger, a historical excavation conducted by 2 retirees with more determination than resources. Opal spread the letters across their kitchen table in chronological order, creating a timeline that told the story of a community's slow death. The earliest letters, from late 1945 and early 1946, were almost cheerful. Emmeline wrote to her brother Sterling about teaching school, about harvest festivals, about a town that didn't yet know it was condemned. But by mid-1946, the tone shifted. Government surveyors had arrived. Men in suits from Washington walked the valley with measuring equipment and clipboards, making notes, taking photographs, speaking in technical language about water tables and reservoir capacity and unavoidable progress. The families of Clearwater Valley organized. They held meetings in the white church that appeared in the photograph Opal had found. They wrote letters to congressmen and senators. They hired a lawyer from Billings who promised to fight the dam project in court. Emmeline's letters from this period were filled with hope and defiance. "We will not be erased," she wrote in November of 1946. "We will not let them steal our history." But the government had already decided. The Clearwater Dam project was designated critical infrastructure for post-war development. The Bureau of Reclamation had budgeted $12 million for construction. The valley would flood. The only question was how much compensation the residents would receive. That's where the story turned dark. Opal found letters from early 1947 describing the compensation offers. The government appraised the entire valley, 800 residents, 200 homes, 3 churches, 1 school, countless businesses, at just under $200,000 total, less than $300 per person. Families who'd owned land for 3 generations were offered amounts that wouldn't buy a year's worth of groceries. Merrick read one letter aloud, his voice tight with anger. "They came to the Harrison farm today," Emmeline wrote in March of 1947. "Offered Calvin $800 for 160 acres, the house his grandfather built, the barn, everything. When Calvin refused, they said eminent domain would take it for less. They said we should be grateful for any compensation at all. They called us obstacles to progress." "It's theft," Opal said quietly. "Legal theft, but theft all the same." "And Emmeline knew it," Merrick replied. "That's why she started hiding things." The letters from April through August of 1947 detailed the repository's construction. Emmeline and several trusted community members, including someone named Thomas Beckett, who appeared frequently in the correspondence, began secretly moving valuables to the Cliffside location. They worked at night. They used pack mules to carry heavy items up trails the surveyors didn't know existed. They built underground caches using techniques Emmeline's father, apparently a mining engineer, had taught her. The list of what they hid was staggering. Gold coins and silver certificates from families who didn't trust banks after the Depression, jewelry passed down through generations, stock certificates and bonds from companies like Standard Oil and General Electric, purchased in the 1920s and 30s when shares cost pennies. Land deeds and property titles the families refused to surrender. Photographs and personal letters and birth records, the paper trail of lives lived. But most significantly, Emmeline hid something the government desperately wanted to erase: documentation. Receipts showing what the property was actually worth. Independent appraisals conducted before the government surveyors arrived. Letters from bureau officials admitting the compensation was inadequate but politically expedient. Evidence of bribes paid to local officials who facilitated the land seizure. She was building a case, Opal said, understanding dawning. She knew the legal fight would continue after the flood. She was preserving evidence. Evidence that could prove corruption, Merrick added. Evidence that could cost people their careers, maybe their freedom. Which means, Opal said slowly, someone had a very good reason to make sure Emmeline Thatcher never told anyone where that evidence was hidden. They both looked at the death certificate again. Drowned, April 16, 1948. The reservoir filling had begun in March. By April, the lower valley was already underwater. The official story was that Emmeline had returned to retrieve personal items from her family home and been caught by rising water. Tragic but unavoidable, the newspaper obituary said. A reminder of the dangers of ignoring evacuation orders. Except Emmeline's last letter, dated March 28, 1948, suggested something different. "I've completed the sealing," she wrote to Sterling. "The repository is secure. I'm leaving tomorrow with Mother and the others. By the time you read this, Clearwater will be gone. But what we were, what we built, what they tried to take, that will remain. Hidden, but not lost. Waiting for someone honest enough to find it and brave enough to use it." The letter was found in Sterling's effects when he died in Billings in 1983, Opal discovered through her research. He'd kept it his entire life, but never returned to search for the repository. Maybe he'd been too afraid. Maybe he hadn't believed it was real. Or maybe, Opal suggested, he knew someone was watching, waiting for him to lead them to it. "Which brings us back to now," Merrick said, "to Dalton Voss and his convenient condemnation notice." Opal had been digging into the Voss family history with the tenacity of a woman who'd spent 40 years tracking down obscure research materials. What she found made the pattern clear. Raymond Voss, Dalton's grandfather, had been assistant director of the Clearwater Dam project from 1946 to 1951. He'd been responsible for property acquisition and resident relocation. After the dam was completed, he'd retired to Ridgemont with enough money to buy a large house and invest in local real estate. Comfortable retirement for a mid-level government bureaucrat, Opal noted, or suspicious wealth for someone who might have been skimming compensation funds. Raymond's son, Dalton's father, had worked in county government his entire career. County assessor, then county commissioner, always involved in land deals and property disputes. And now Dalton, third-generation county building inspector, with the authority to condemn properties and the access to know which properties might be valuable. "They've been looking for it," Merrick said. "For 3 generations, the Voss family has been trying to find what Emmeline hid. Or making sure no one else does," Opal added. That afternoon, they had a visitor. Not Dalton Voss this time, but someone unexpected. A young woman, late 20s, pulled up in a dusty Subaru with Colorado plates. She wore jeans and a canvas jacket, carried a leather satchel that looked well-traveled. She knocked on their door with confidence. "Mr. and Mrs. Holbrook? My name is Iris Calloway. I'm an investigative journalist with the Rocky Mountain Independent. I was hoping you might have time to talk." Merrick and Opal exchanged glances. "About what?" Merrick asked carefully. "About why the county is so eager to condemn your property," Iris said. and about what you might have found that's making certain people very nervous." Merrick's hand tightened on the doorframe. "What makes you think we found anything?" Iris smiled. "Because 3 days ago, Dalton Voss filed a request with the County Commission for Emergency Demolition Authority. He wants to tear down your cabin immediately, skip the 60-day notice. That request was denied, but it tells me he's worried about something. And when government officials get worried, that's usually when the real story starts. They invited her in. What choice did they have? If she was already investigating, better to know what she knew." Iris settled at their kitchen table, pulled out a notebook and recorder. "May I?" Opal nodded. Iris pressed record. "I've been researching government land seizures in the Mountain West for 2 years," she began. "Patterns of eminent domain abuse, families displaced for projects that benefit private developers more than public interests, that sort of thing. Ridgemont County kept appearing in my research. Unusually high number of condemned properties over the past 30 years. Most of them purchased shortly after condemnation by a network of LLCs that all trace back to the same law firm." "Let me guess," Merrick said. "A law firm with connections to the Voss family." Iris raised her eyebrows. "You've been doing your homework?" "Yes, the firm is Voss and Partners. Dalton's uncle is the senior partner. They've made millions buying condemned properties at auction, then developing or reselling them." Opal felt sick. "So this isn't about safety at all, it's about profit." "It's usually about profit," Iris said. "But your case felt different. The urgency, the pushing for emergency demolition, that suggested something more immediate. So I started digging into the history of your property." She pulled out her own folder of documents. "That's when I found the Clearwater Valley connection, and Emmeline Thatcher's death certificate, and the fact that Raymond Voss was investigated, though never charged, for misappropriation of relocation funds in 1949. "Investigated by who?" Merrick asked. "Federal auditors," Iris said. "Apparently some of the displaced families complained they never received their full compensation, but the investigation was dropped after 6 months. Insufficient evidence. Raymond Voss retired with full pension." "Because the evidence was buried," Opal said quietly. "Literally buried, hidden by Emmeline before she died." Iris leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Merrick and Opal looked at each other, making a decision that would change everything. Then Merrick stood, retrieved the metal box from its hiding place, and set it on the table. "This," he said, "is what Emmeline Thatcher hid. And this is why they want us gone." Iris listened to their story without interrupting, her eyes growing wider with each revelation. She examined the letters carefully, photographed the map, made notes in her quick journalist's shorthand. When they finished, she sat back, processing. "Do you understand what you have here?" she asked. "This isn't just a treasure hunt. This is documented evidence of government corruption. Proof that families were systematically defrauded, and if the rest of the repository contains what these letters suggest, financial records, correspondence, independent appraisals, then you're sitting on one of the biggest historical revelations this state has seen." "Which is why it's dangerous," Opal said. Iris nodded. "Extremely dangerous. If the repository contains evidence that could implicate powerful families still influential in county politics, then yes, people will do whatever it takes to keep it buried." "Including condemning our home," Merrick said. "Or worse," Iris replied. "Emmeline Thatcher drowned under suspicious circumstances. You need to be careful." But Merrick was tired of being careful. He'd spent 3 days cataloguing markers, piecing together a 77-year-old puzzle, watching for tire tracks in his driveway. He was 73 years old. He'd survived wars and construction accidents and a heart attack in 2015. He wasn't about to be scared off his own property by some corrupt building inspector and his family's guilty secrets. "We're going to follow this map to the end," he told Iris. "We're going to find what Emmeline hid. And when we do, we're going to make sure it goes to the right people, the families she was trying to protect." Then let me help, Iris said. You need documentation, independent verification, someone on record witnessing whatever you find. Otherwise, the county will claim you planted it or fake it or stole it. But if a journalist is there, documenting everything, they can't make it disappear. Merrick extended his hand. Iris shook it firmly. Opal smiled for the first time in days. They started the next morning at dawn. The map showed 6 more markers beyond the 4 Merrick and Opal had already located. Each marker spiraled closer to the cabin's center, and according to Emmeline's notes, each cache contained progressively more valuable items. The outer markers held personal effects and some precious metals. The inner markers, she'd written cryptically, held the truth. Iris documented everything. She filmed Merrick using his surveying equipment, recorded Opal reading Emmeline's directions aloud, photographed each marker as they uncovered it. The work was slow, methodical, deliberate. Merrick's back ached. Opal's arthritic hands cramped around the shovel, but they kept going. The 5th marker, located near a lightning-struck pine about 80 feet from the cabin, contained something that made them all stop breathing. Inside the waterproof container was a leather portfolio filled with documents. Contracts signed by Raymond Voss himself, showing properties purchased from relocated families at fractions of their value, then immediately resold at enormous profit. Receipts for payments made to county officials for favorable appraisals. Letters discussing how to minimize compensation while maximizing government efficiency. "This is it," Iris whispered, her camera still recording. "This is the smoking gun." "There's more," Opal said, pointing to the map. 2 more markers. They found the 6th marker at the base of a large boulder that had probably been there since the last ice age. This cache was larger, a trunk rather than a box. Inside were family treasures, silverware with monograms, jewelry boxes containing rings and necklaces and brooches, a violin case holding an instrument that might still play if restored, photographs in ornate frames showing people in old-fashioned clothes, people who'd trusted the government to treat them fairly and been betrayed. Opal wept openly as they catalogued each item. "These belonged to someone," she said. "Someone's grandmother wore this necklace. Someone's daughter played this violin. These aren't just valuable objects. They're memories, lives." Merrick put his arm around her shoulders. "And we're going to make sure they get home." The 7th and final marker, according to Emmeline's map, was directly beneath the cabin itself. Under the fireplace, she'd written, "Where we began, there we end. Deepest cache, most important contents, the foundation of truth." They stood in their small living room, staring at the stone fireplace where they'd found the first metal box. Behind that fireplace was empty space. They knew because Merrick had removed those stones. But Emmeline's note suggested going deeper, under the fireplace, not behind it. "Which means," Merrick said slowly, "we need to look beneath the hearth itself." The hearth was a massive slab of granite, probably weighing several hundred pounds. It had been there since the cabin was built, or so Merrick had always assumed. Now he wondered. He examined the edges carefully, running his fingers along the seams. There, on the eastern corner, a gap, almost invisible but present, and when he pressed down, the stone shifted slightly. "It's on a pivot," he said, amazed. "The whole slab is balanced. Give me a hand." Together, Merrick and Iris pushed while Opal wedged a pry bar into the gap. Slowly, with a grinding sound that suggested decades of disuse, the hearthstone rotated, revealing a dark opening beneath. Merrick shined his flashlight down. Stone steps led into darkness, carved directly into the bedrock the cabin sat upon. What happens next will turn this night upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Merrick descended first, flashlight in one hand, the other trailing along the rough stone wall. The steps were steep and narrow, carved with precision but not comfort. Iris followed with her camera, filming everything. Opal came last, moving carefully, her hand gripping the wall. The stairs went down 12 feet, maybe 15, deep enough to be below the cabin's foundation, deep into the cliff itself. At the bottom, the passage opened into a chamber, not large, maybe 10 feet by 12, but high-ceilinged, carved from solid rock. And filling nearly every inch of space were containers, metal trunks, wooden crates, sealed barrels, leather cases, dozens of them, all marked with neat labels in Emmeline's handwriting. "Oh my God," Iris breathed. Her camera swept across the chamber, capturing everything. "This is incredible." Merrick moved deeper into the space, reading labels. Harrison family silver, Beckett land documents, Martinez stock certificates, Chen family gold. And there, against the far wall, a metal filing cabinet that looked absurdly out of place in this underground vault. The label read simply, "Evidence." He opened the top drawer. Inside were files, dozens of them, organized with the precision of someone who understood how important documentation would be. Each file was labeled with a family name and contained appraisals, property values, government compensation offers, and the discrepancy between them. The Anderson family owned a ranch appraised at $45,000 in 1946. The government offered them $900. The Martinez family farm, worth $32,000, compensated at $650. File after file told the same story. Systematic undervaluation. Families robbed in the name of progress. And in the bottom drawer, a file labeled Voss, Raymond. Inside were letters, receipts, bank statements showing deposits that corresponded with property acquisitions, photocopies of checks made out to county officials, a handwritten ledger tracking payoffs. Emmeline had been meticulous. She'd documented everything, and she'd hidden it where it could survive, protected by stone and darkness and time. Opal opened one of the trunks. Inside was a collection of jewelry that would make a museum curator weep. Another trunk held gold coins, hundreds of them, some dating back to the 1800s. A third contained stock certificates from companies that had become giants: Ford Motor Company, Coca-Cola, IBM, shares purchased for pennies in the 1920s and 30s, now worth fortunes. Iris was filming everything, her journalistic objectivity cracking into pure amazement. "Do you have any idea what this is worth?" she asked. "Financially, I mean." Merrick had been making rough calculations. The gold alone, at current market prices, had to be worth several million. The stock certificates, if they were still valid, could be worth tens of millions. The jewelry, the silver, the other precious metals, maybe another few million. But the real value, he knew, wasn't monetary. "This is history," he said quietly. "This is proof that the government destroyed a community and profited from it. This is evidence that could force a reckoning." They spent hours in the chamber, cataloguing, photographing, documenting. Iris conducted video interviews with Merrick and Opal, recording their story for posterity. They were careful not to disturb anything, not to remove items except for the files they needed to make copies of. This was evidence now, not treasure. When they finally climbed back up to the cabin, evening light was slanting through the windows. They were exhausted, dusty, overwhelmed. Iris sat at the kitchen table, reviewing her footage, shaking her head in disbelief. "This is the biggest story of my career," she said. "Maybe the biggest story in this state's history. When this goes public, people are going to lose their minds." "When it goes public," Opal corrected, "not if. We need to be strategic about this." Merrick agreed. "If we just announce we found a vault of stolen property, Dalton Voss and his people will find a way to seize it. They'll claim it's government property or stolen goods or archaeological artifacts that require federal oversight. They'll tie it up in courts for decades." "So what do we do?" Iris asked. "We build a case first," Opal said, her librarian instincts taking over. "We document everything. We identify the families these items belong to. We find descendants, get their stories on record. We create a historical narrative that's so well documented, so thoroughly researched, that it can't be dismissed or buried. And then," Merrick added, "we go public all at once. files released to media, items catalogued and claimed by rightful owners, corruption exposed in a way that's too big to hide. Iris smiled. I can help with that. I have contacts at every major paper in the region. We could coordinate a simultaneous release. Front page everywhere. But we need time, Opal said. Weeks, maybe months to do this right. Time they weren't going to get. Because the next morning, Dalton Voss arrived again. This time, he brought reinforcements. 3 county vehicles pulled into the clearing. Voss emerged from the first with papers in hand. From the second came 2 sheriff's deputies. From the third, a man in a suit who introduced himself as county attorney. Mr. and Mrs. Holbrook, the attorney said, his voice professionally sympathetic. I'm afraid the county commission held an emergency meeting last night. Given the severity of the structural concerns and new evidence of imminent collapse risk, they've granted emergency demolition authority. You have 72 hours to remove your possessions. After that, this structure will be demolished for public safety. Merrick felt rage boil up inside him. What new evidence? I've surveyed every inch of this property. The structure is sound. Voss held up a folder. We've received an independent engineering report documenting severe foundation cracking and cliff erosion. The risk of collapse is immediate. Let me see that report, Merrick demanded. Voss handed it over with a smirk. Merrick read quickly, his engineer's eye catching errors immediately. The measurements were wrong. The cliff edge was listed as 8 feet from the cabin when it was actually 15. The bedrock was described as sedimentary when any geologist could see it was granite. The entire report was fabricated. This is fraudulent, Merrick said flatly. Whoever wrote this never set foot on my property. That's a serious accusation, the county attorney said. Are you suggesting county officials are lying? I'm saying this report is false, Merrick replied. And I can prove it. You have 72 hours, Voss said, his voice hardening. After that, we're coming in with equipment whether you're gone or not. They left the same way they came, fast and final. Merrick stood in the clearing, hands shaking with anger. Opal came out, put her arm around him. They know, she said quietly. They know we found something. Iris was already on her phone, calling her editor. We need to accelerate the timeline, she said. If they demolish the cabin, they'll destroy the entrance to the chamber. Everything Emmeline hid will be buried again, maybe permanently. Then we stop them, Merrick said. How? Opal asked. They have the law on their side, corrupt as it is. Merrick thought for a long moment. Then we use the one thing they can't fight, public attention. We go public now, today. We show the world what we found and why they're so desperate to bury it again. But we're not ready, Opal protested. We haven't contacted all the families. We haven't finished documenting everything. We're out of time, Merrick said. We either fight now or we lose everything. Iris, can you get a story published by tomorrow? Iris nodded. I can have something online tonight, print edition tomorrow morning. But are you sure? Once this is public, there's no taking it back. You'll be in the spotlight. There will be legal battles, media attention, maybe threats. Merrick looked at Opal. She squeezed his hand, nodded once. We're sure, he said. Iris spent the next 6 hours writing. Merrick and Opal gave her everything. Letters, photographs, documents from the evidence files, video footage from the chamber. Iris crafted a story that was both investigative journalism and historical revelation. She detailed the Clearwater Valley displacement, the inadequate compensation, the Voss family's involvement, and the repository Emmeline Thatcher had created. She quoted from Emmeline's letters, explained the discovery of the hidden chamber, and outlined the evidence of corruption. The headline read, Buried Truth, How One Woman Hid Evidence of Government Fraud for 77 Years and How an Elderly Couple Found It. She sent it to her editor at 6 p.m. By 7, her phone was ringing. Her editor had read it twice, called the paper's attorney, and made a decision. They were running it, front page, above the fold with a full spread inside. Online version going live at midnight. By 8 p.m., Iris had contacted other journalists, sending them embargoed copies with permission to publish at midnight. Associated Press, Denver Post, regional papers across Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado. By morning, the story would be everywhere. Merrick and Opal spent that evening sitting on their deck, watching the sunset, knowing their lives were about to change in ways they couldn't predict. Opal leaned against Merrick's shoulder. "Do you think Emmeline would approve?" she asked. "Of what we're doing?" Merrick thought about the woman in the photograph, the schoolteacher who'd refused to let her community be erased, who'd worked in darkness to preserve light. "I think she'd be proud," he said. "We're finishing what she started." At midnight, Iris's article went live. Within an hour, it had been shared 1,000 times. By morning, it was on the front page of 17 newspapers. Television crews were requesting interviews. The story was trending on social media. Photographs of the underground chamber, of Emmeline's letters, of the evidence files were everywhere. And in Ridgemont, county officials were scrambling. Dalton Voss's phone rang continuously. The county attorney was served with requests for comment. The county commission called an emergency meeting. Because suddenly, what had been a quiet condemnation of a forgotten cabin had become a national story about justice, corruption, and one woman's 77-year fight to tell the truth. Merrick and Opal watched the sunrise from their deck, knowing that whatever happened next, they'd done the right thing. They'd given voice to Emmeline Thatcher and the 800 people of Clearwater Valley. They'd exposed corruption that 3 generations had tried to hide, and they'd proven that sometimes the most powerful resistance comes from the most unexpected places. An elderly couple with grease-stained hands and library cards had just changed history. By 8 a.m., there were news vans parked along the access road to the cabin. Helicopters circled overhead, filming aerial shots of the Cliffside property that had suddenly become the center of a national conversation. Merrick stood on his deck, coffee mug in hand, watching the circus unfold with a mixture of disbelief and grim satisfaction. Opal was inside fielding phone calls. Relatives they hadn't spoken to in years suddenly wanted to check in. Friends from their retirement community were calling with support and concern. Reporters were requesting interviews. Lawyers were offering representation. The phone hadn't stopped ringing since 6 a.m. Iris arrived at 9, looking exhausted but energized. "My editor wants a follow-up piece," she said, climbing the porch steps. "Human interest angle. Who are Merrick and Opal Holbrook, and why did they risk everything to expose this?" "We're nobody special," Merrick said. "Just 2 people who bought a cabin and found more than we bargained for." "That's exactly what makes it special," Iris replied. "You're not politicians or activists or treasure hunters. You're regular people who did the right thing when it would have been easier to walk away." Before Merrick could respond, 3 black SUVs pulled into the clearing. Men in suits emerged, followed by a woman carrying a briefcase that probably cost more than Merrick's truck. She approached with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room. "Mr. and Mrs. Holbrook," she called out. "I'm Victoria Mansfield, attorney representing the county commission. We need to talk." Opal emerged from the cabin, standing beside Merrick. "Talk about what?" she asked. Victoria climbed the porch steps, her heels clicking against the wood. "About resolving this situation in a way that benefits everyone. The county is prepared to withdraw the condemnation notice and offer substantial compensation for your cooperation." "Cooperation meaning what?" Merrick asked. "Meaning you allow us to properly secure and inventory the items you've discovered. This is potentially government property dating back to a federal project. There are protocols, legal procedures that must be followed." Opal crossed her arms. "Protocols like the ones Raymond Voss followed when he stole from displaced families." Victoria's expression didn't change. "I'm not here to litigate history, Mrs. Holbrook. I'm here to prevent a legal nightmare." If you continue down this path, claiming ownership of items that may belong to the federal government or to descendants scattered across the country, you'll spend years in court. Expensive years. Sounds like a threat, Merrick said. It's reality, Victoria replied. The county is offering you $200,000 to step aside and let proper authorities handle this discovery. You keep your cabin, we drop the condemnation, and everyone moves forward. $200,000, Opal repeated. To abandon the families Emmeline died trying to protect. To avoid destroying your retirement fighting legal battles you cannot win, Victoria said. You're 73 and 71 years old. Do you really want to spend your remaining years in courtrooms? Merrick looked at Opal. She looked back at him. 49 years of marriage meant they didn't need words. Yes, Merrick said simply. Yes, we do. Because some things matter more than comfort. Victoria's jaw tightened. Then you're making a serious mistake. She turned to leave, then paused. The county has filed for an emergency injunction to prevent you from removing anything else from the chamber. Federal marshals will be here by this afternoon to secure the site. I'd advise you not to interfere. She left in a cloud of expensive perfume and implied threats. Iris had filmed the entire exchange. This is gold, she muttered. David versus Goliath in real time. But Merrick felt the weight of what they'd started pressing down. We need help, he said. Real help. Lawyers who know what they're doing. As if in answer, another vehicle pulled up. This one was a modest sedan, not a government SUV. Out stepped a woman in her 50s wearing practical clothes and carrying a worn leather briefcase. She had grey streaking through her dark hair and the kind of face that suggested she'd seen too much injustice to be shocked by more. Mr. and Mrs. Holbrook? She called. My name is Margot Brennan. I'm a property rights attorney from Denver. I've been following your story since midnight. I'd like to help if you'll have me. What kind of help? Opal asked cautiously. Margot climbed the steps, set her briefcase down. The kind that doesn't cost you anything up front and understands that this isn't about money. It's about justice. I've spent 20 years fighting government overreach and eminent domain abuse. What happened to Clearwater Valley? What the Voss family did? That's exactly the kind of corruption I dedicate my practice to exposing. Why would you work for free? Merrick asked. Margot smiled. Because cases like this, when we win, and we will win, the court orders the government to pay legal fees. But more than that, because your story matters. Those families deserve justice, even if it's 77 years late. They invited her inside. Margot spread her briefcase contents across the kitchen table, pushing aside the breakfast dishes Opal hadn't had time to clear. First thing we need to do is establish clear legal standing, she said. The items in the chamber fall into several categories, each with different ownership implications. She pulled out a legal pad and began making notes. Personal effects and family heirlooms belong to descendants of the original owners. That's straightforward. We'll need to identify and locate those descendants, but ownership is clear. Precious metals and currency are more complicated. If they were legally owned by the families and never claimed by the government, they likely belong to the estate or descendants. But we'll need documentation. We have documentation, Opal said. Emmeline kept meticulous records. Each item is labeled with the family name. That's good, Margot said. That helps enormously. But the real legal complexity is the evidence files, documents proving government corruption. Those may be considered public records or evidence of criminal activity, which means they might need to be turned over to authorities. Over to the same county officials who are implicated, Merrick asked. No, Margot said firmly, to federal authorities. If we can prove corruption in a federal project, jurisdiction shifts, and that's when things get interesting. Interesting how? Iris asked, her recorder running. Interesting because the federal statute of limitations for fraud doesn't apply to cases where the fraud was actively concealed, Margot explained. If we can show that Raymond Voss and others deliberately hid evidence of their crimes, the government could potentially be liable for restitution to the descendants. We're talking about a class action lawsuit that could result in tens of millions in compensation. But that would take years, Opal said. Yes, Margot agreed. But in the meantime, we file for emergency protective orders. We get the chamber designated as a historical site. We prevent anyone, county or federal, from disturbing it until proper archaeological and historical documentation is complete. We turn the government's own bureaucracy against them. Merrick liked the way she thought. What do you need from us? Everything, Margot said. Every letter, every photograph, every piece of documentation you have. I need to build a timeline that's bulletproof, and I need you to trust me when I say this is going to get uglier before it gets better. She wasn't wrong. By noon, federal marshals had indeed arrived, along with representatives from the Bureau of Land Management and the Army Corps of Engineers. They set up a perimeter around the cabin, preventing anyone from entering or leaving without authorization. Merrick and Opal were effectively under house arrest on their own property. Margot immediately filed paperwork with the Federal District Court, requesting an emergency hearing. Iris published updates every hour, documenting the government response. And on social media, something unexpected began to happen. People started organizing. It started with a post from someone claiming to be a descendant of the Martinez family, one of the families mentioned in Emmeline's letters. The post read simply, "My great-grandmother Rosa Martinez was forced out of Clearwater Valley with 3 children and $50. She died in poverty in 1962. If the Holbrooks found what belonged to my family, I want it back, not for the money, for her memory." Within hours, dozens more people came forward. Children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of Clearwater Valley families, people who'd grown up hearing stories of the valley that was stolen, the compensation that never came, the government that lied. They shared photographs of ancestors, told stories passed down through generations, expressed gratitude that someone finally cared enough to expose the truth. Opal spent the afternoon on her laptop, reading these stories and weeping. Merrick stood beside her, hand on her shoulder, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they'd uncovered. This wasn't just about one community 77 years ago. This was about generational trauma, economic devastation that rippled through families for decades, opportunities lost, poverty endured, all because the government decided some people didn't matter. By evening, people started showing up in person. First came an elderly man in his 80s driving a pickup truck with Montana plates. He introduced himself as William Harrison, grandson of Calvin Harrison, who'd owned the farm mentioned in Emmeline's letters. "I drove 12 hours, he said, tears in his eyes. "My grandfather talked about Clearwater Valley until the day he died. Said they stole his life's work and paid him pocket change. Is it true? Did you really find proof?" Merrick showed him the evidence files. William read his grandfather's folder, saw the appraisal showing the farm was worth $45,000, saw the government offer of $900, and broke down sobbing. "My grandfather died thinking he'd failed us," William said. "Died believing he should have fought harder. But he did fight. They just cheated him anyway." More descendants arrived throughout the evening. Some brought their own documentation, letters and photographs and stories that corroborated what Emmeline had hidden. Others came simply to bear witness, to stand with Merrick and Opal, to make sure the government couldn't make this disappear again. By midnight, there were 37 people camped around the cabin. They brought tents and sleeping bags and portable generators. They set up a perimeter outside the government perimeter, and they waited. A community reassembling itself 77 years after being scattered. Iris documented everything. "The government can't make this go away now," she said. "There are too many witnesses, too many voices." But the county wasn't giving up. The next morning, Dalton Voss appeared with even more officials. This time, they brought documents declaring the entire property a crime scene, subject to federal investigation. They ordered everyone to disperse within 1 hour or face arrest. Margot stepped forward. On what grounds? She demanded. What crime is being investigated? Voss smirked. Theft of government property, potential archaeological site disturbance, and obstruction of a federal investigation. Margot pulled out her phone, made a call. Within 10 minutes, she had a federal judge on speakerphone. "Your Honor," she said, "I'm requesting an emergency stay of all enforcement actions pending a hearing on the merits. The county is attempting to seize a historical site containing evidence of government corruption. We have multiple descendants of displaced families present who claim ownership of items in the repository." The judge, a woman named Catherine Morrison, who'd apparently been reading the news coverage, asked pointed questions. Voss fumbled his answers, contradicted himself, finally admitted that no actual federal investigation had been opened. Judge Morrison's voice came through the speaker sharp and clear. "Mr. Voss, I'm issuing a temporary restraining order against any action by county or federal officials pending a full hearing in my courtroom Monday morning. Nobody touches that property, nobody removes anything, and nobody arrests anyone. Am I understood?" "Yes, Your Honor," Voss said, his face red. "Good," Judge Morrison said, "because I'm very interested in hearing why a county building inspector is so concerned with a 77-year-old fraud case. See you Monday." The call ended. The descendants cheered. Voss retreated to his vehicles, making angry phone calls. Margot allowed herself a small smile. "That buys us the weekend," she said. "We use every second." What they did next was extraordinary. Opal, using her librarian skills, organized a massive documentation effort. Descendants brought documents, photographs, and family records. They cross-referenced everything with Emmeline's letters and the evidence files. They built a database showing exactly which families lost what, how much they were compensated versus actual value, and where those families ended up. Merrick, meanwhile, worked with a structural engineer who'd volunteered his services, conducting a legitimate survey of the property. They documented that the cabin was perfectly sound, that the cliff showed no signs of dangerous erosion, and that the county's condemnation report was fabricated. They filmed everything, creating an ironclad record. Iris coordinated with other journalists who'd arrived, ensuring accurate coverage. She also connected descendants with each other, facilitating reunions between distant cousins who'd never met, branches of families that had lost touch after the displacement. And in the underground chamber, carefully supervised by Margot and documented by Iris, they conducted a complete inventory. Every item was photographed, catalogued, and matched to Emmeline's records. The scope of what they found was staggering. By Sunday evening, they had numbers. 117 gold coins of various denominations, 43 pounds of sterling silver in the form of flatware, serving pieces, and decorative items. Jewelry appraised at an estimated $4.2 million. Stock certificates from 23 different companies, most now worth substantial sums, collectively valued at somewhere between $48 and $63 million depending on current market conditions. But the real treasure was in the evidence files. Contracts showing Raymond Voss personally profited from property purchases at below-market rates. Letters between government officials discussing how to minimize compensation while maximizing budget surplus, which they then allocated to other projects and personal enrichment. Independent appraisals showing the Clearwater Valley properties were collectively worth over $8.6 million. Not the $197,000 the government paid. And most damning, a letter from Raymond Voss to a colleague dated August 1948 that read, "The Thatcher woman was asking too many questions. She had documents that could cause us significant problems. Her accidental drowning was unfortunate but timely. We should have no further complications from that quarter." When Margot read that letter, her hands shook. "This isn't just fraud," she said quietly. "This is murder." Raymond Voss arranged Emmeline Thatcher's death and called it an accident. The room fell silent. Iris's camera kept rolling, capturing the moment they realized the full scope of the crime. Opal covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Merrick sat down hard, the weight of it overwhelming. Emmeline knew, Opal whispered. She knew they might kill her. That's why she wrote everything down, hid it so carefully. She knew the truth would either die with her or survive her. She bet on survival. And 77 years later, William Harrison said she won. That night, the descendants held a vigil. They built a bonfire in the clearing, careful to keep it safe and contained, and they told stories. Stories of grandparents who never stopped mourning Clearwater Valley. Of poverty endured because the government compensation wasn't enough to start over. Of communities shattered, families separated, dreams destroyed. But also stories of resilience, of survival, of how their ancestors had rebuilt lives from nothing. Merrick and Opal sat among them, no longer outsiders, but part of something larger. "We never had children," Opal said quietly to William Harrison. "We always wondered what our legacy would be. I think maybe this is it, giving your families back their history." William squeezed her hand. "You've given us more than that," he said. "You've given us justice." Monday morning arrived too quickly. The federal courthouse in the state capital was 3 hours away. Margot organized a convoy, Merrick and Opal in her car, Iris following with her equipment, and 23 descendants in vehicles behind them. They arrived to find television crews already set up, broadcasting live. Inside the courtroom, the county's legal team filled 2 entire tables. Victoria Mansfield was there, along with Dalton Voss and at least 6 other attorneys. They looked expensive and confident. On the other side, Margot sat with Merrick and Opal and a single junior associate she'd brought for note-taking. But behind them, filling every available seat, were the descendants. Judge Morrison entered, surveyed the packed courtroom, and took her seat. "Let me be clear from the start," she said. "This is an emergency hearing to determine if the temporary restraining order should continue pending full litigation. I will hear opening statements, review key evidence, and make a determination. This is not a trial." "Understood?" Both sides acknowledged. Victoria Mansfield stood first, her presentation polished and practiced. "Your Honor, this case is quite simple. The Holbrooks discovered what may be government property from a federal project completed in 1948. Regardless of the interesting historical questions raised, the immediate issue is preservation and proper handling of potential artifacts. The county's condemnation was issued in good faith based on legitimate safety concerns. We ask that the property be placed under federal custodianship pending proper archaeological and legal review." Margot stood when it was her turn, but she didn't look at the judge. She looked at the descendants. "Your Honor, this case is about whether justice delayed is justice denied. Whether the government can commit fraud, commit murder, and then use bureaucracy to cover it up for 77 years. Whether the descendants of 800 displaced Americans have any rights at all." She presented their evidence methodically. Emmeline's letters establishing the repository's purpose, the evidence files proving systematic fraud, the independent appraisals showing how much the families were actually owed, and finally Raymond Voss's letter about Emmeline's convenient drowning. Victoria objected immediately. "Your Honor, that letter, if authentic, which we dispute, would be evidence in a potential criminal matter and should be turned over to law enforcement, not presented in a civil hearing." Judge Morrison looked at the letter, read it twice, and her expression hardened. "Miss Mansfield," she said, "are you seriously arguing that evidence of a murder should be suppressed to protect a county's condemnation action?" "I'm arguing for proper procedure, Your Honor." "The procedure here," Judge Morrison said coldly, "is that I determine what happens to this property while we sort out the larger questions. And having read this evidence, I can tell you what's not going to happen. This property is not being turned over to the same county government whose former officials are implicated in fraud and possible homicide." She looked at Margot. "Counselor, What are you proposing? Margot stood. We propose the court appoint an independent special master to oversee the chamber and its contents. We propose immediate genealogical research to identify all descendants of Clearwater Valley families. We propose a transparent process for returning personal items to rightful owners and establishing a trust for monetary assets until ownership is properly determined. And we propose that the cabin and chamber be designated a historical site, protected from any demolition or interference. And the fraud allegations, Judge Morrison asked. We're filing a formal complaint with the Justice Department, Margot said. We're requesting a federal investigation into the Clearwater Valley displacement project and all officials involved. We believe the evidence supports criminal charges, though obviously that's beyond this court's jurisdiction. Victoria started to object again, but Judge Morrison held up her hand. I've heard enough. Here's my ruling. The temporary restraining order is extended indefinitely. The county's condemnation is stayed pending resolution of the underlying issues. I'm appointing Professor Wendell Ashcroft from the State Historical Society as special master to oversee the site and conduct proper documentation. Descendants who can prove lineage to Clearwater Valley families will be given access to claim personal effects. All monetary assets are frozen pending determination of ownership. She looked directly at Dalton Voss. And Mr. Voss, you are removed from any involvement in this matter. Given your family's history, your continued participation represents an obvious conflict of interest. If you set foot on that property again, I'll hold you in contempt. Voss's face went purple, but he said nothing. Judge Morrison continued. I'm also ordering that all evidence related to Raymond Voss and Emmeline Thatcher's death be turned over to the Attorney General's office for investigation. If Miss Thatcher was murdered to conceal fraud, that crime has no statute of limitations. She banged her gavel. We're adjourned. I want status reports every 2 weeks until this is resolved. The courtroom erupted in cheers from the descendants. Victoria Mansfield gathered her files with tight-lipped fury. Iris captured it all on camera. And Merrick and Opal sat quietly, holding hands, overwhelmed by what they'd set in motion. Outside, the press conference was chaos. Iris helped manage it, making sure descendant voices were heard along with Merrick and Opal's. William Harrison spoke about his grandfather's suffering. A woman named Patricia Chen talked about how her grandmother had died in poverty, penniless despite owning valuable land. A younger man, maybe 40, explained that his family had been scattered across 3 states after the displacement and had never fully recovered economically. Merrick kept it simple when reporters asked him questions. We just wanted to save our home, he said. We had no idea what we'd find or what it would mean, but once we knew the truth, we couldn't walk away. Emmeline Thatcher died trying to protect these families. The least we could do was finish what she started. What happens now? A reporter asked. Now, Opal said, we make sure every family gets what belongs to them. Not just the money or the items, but their history, their dignity. The acknowledgement that what happened to them was wrong. The story dominated news cycles for weeks. Professor Ashcroft, the court-appointed special master, brought in a team of historians, archaeologists, and genealogists. They worked methodically through the chamber, documenting everything according to academic standards. They also began the massive project of tracking down descendants. It turned out there were hundreds of them. The 800 residents of Clearwater Valley had scattered across the country, but they'd had children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Some families had stayed connected to their valley roots, others had forgotten entirely. The stories lost over generations. Now they were all being contacted, told about the repository, invited to reclaim what had been hidden. The returns began in late autumn. Families received letters and photographs of grandparents they'd never met. Jewelry was returned to great-granddaughters. A violin went to a man who'd become a professional musician, never knowing his ancestor had also played. Gold coins were divided among multiple branches of families who'd lost touch decades ago. But more than physical items, families received validation, official letters from the court acknowledging that their ancestors had been defrauded, documentation showing what their family property had actually been worth, evidence that they hadn't failed or given up, they'd been systematically robbed by their own government. The stock certificates created their own complexity. Many were still valid, though requiring authentication and transfer. Some companies no longer existed. Others had merged or restructured. Margot worked with financial experts to determine current value and coordinate transfers to identified heirs. The process would take years, but preliminary estimates suggested the descendants collectively stood to receive somewhere between $60 and $90 million. And the criminal investigation moved forward. The Attorney General's office, under intense public pressure and media scrutiny, opened a formal inquiry into the Clearwater Valley project. They exhumed records from the 1940s, interviewed anyone still living who'd been involved, and built a case. They couldn't prosecute Raymond Voss, dead since 1993, but they could prosecute his legacy. Federal prosecutors filed civil fraud charges against his estate, seeking to recover his ill-gotten gains for redistribution to victims' families. They also pursued corruption charges against several officials who'd participated in the scheme and were still alive, elderly but not beyond the reach of justice. Dalton Voss, meanwhile, faced his own reckoning. The state licensing board investigated his fraudulent engineering report. Local prosecutors examined whether his attempted condemnation constituted corruption or abuse of power. By December, he'd been fired from his position, stripped of his professional licenses, and was facing criminal charges. But perhaps the most significant change happened in Ridgemont itself. The town that had turned a blind eye to the Holbrooks' plight now rallied around them. Local businesses donated supplies for the ongoing documentation work. Residents volunteered to help with genealogical research. The town council passed a resolution officially acknowledging the Clearwater Valley fraud and apologizing for the county's role. And they did something more. They voted to use county funds to build a museum. Not at the cabin, which Merrick and Opal wanted to remain their private home, but in town. The Clearwater Valley Memorial Museum, dedicated to preserving the history of the lost community and ensuring the story was never forgotten. The museum would house copies of all the documents, photographs of items from the repository, oral histories from descendants, and a permanent exhibit about Emmeline Thatcher, the woman who'd fought the government with the only weapons she had, truth and time. By winter, when the first snow fell on Pine Bluff, life had settled into a new rhythm for Merrick and Opal. The constant media attention had faded. The descendants had mostly returned to their scattered homes, though many stayed in touch, sending cards and emails, sharing how the returned items and money had changed their lives. Professor Ashcroft and his team still worked in the chamber several days a week, but they'd become friends. They'd join Merrick and Opal for coffee, share their findings, tell stories about items they'd catalogued. The cabin no longer felt under siege. It felt like what it had always been, a home. Margot visited regularly, updating them on the various legal proceedings. The federal case was moving forward slowly but steadily. More descendants were being identified every month. The museum construction was on schedule. Everything was progressing as it should. One evening in late December, Opal sat at the kitchen table going through a new box of letters that had arrived from descendants. People wrote to thank them, to share family stories, to explain what the repository items meant to their families. One letter from a woman in Oregon made Opal cry. It read, "My grandmother Rosa Martinez died when I was 6 years old. I barely remember her. But my mother always said Grandma Rosa carried a sadness she could never shake, a homesickness for a place that no longer existed. When we received the items from the repository, family photographs we'd never seen, my grandmother's silver brush set, we finally understood her grief. She'd lost everything, and everyone told her she should be grateful for the government's generosity. But she knew the truth. And now, finally, so do we. Thank you for giving us the validation my grandmother never received in life. Thank you for proving she wasn't wrong to mourn what was stolen. You've healed something in our family that's been broken for 77 years. Merrick read the letter over Opal's shoulder, his own eyes wet. This, he said quietly, this is why it mattered. Not the money, not the legal victories. This. Opal nodded. Emmeline would be proud. They'd learned more about Emmeline through Professor Ashcroft's research. She'd been 34 when she died, unmarried, dedicated to her students and her community. She'd taught school for 12 years in Clearwater Valley, believed in education and justice and the power of documentation. She'd kept personal journals, some of which were found in the repository, revealing a woman who understood exactly what she was up against and chose to fight anyway. The journals also revealed that she'd known the risks. She wrote about being followed, about officials who asked too many questions about her activities, about friends who warned her to stop making trouble. In her final entry, dated April 10, 1948, 6 days before her death, she wrote something that haunted Opal. If something happens to me, Emmeline had written, I want it known that I chose this. I could have stayed silent. I could have accepted the injustice and moved on with my life. But silence is complicity, and I'd rather die fighting than live knowing I let them win. The repository is complete. The truth is preserved. Whatever happens now, they can't erase us. They can bury us underwater, but they can't make us forgotten. Someone, someday, will find what I've hidden and they'll know. They'll know we were here. They'll know we mattered. They'll know we were more than obstacles to progress. We were human beings with lives and homes and dignity, and they stole it all. But the truth survives. The truth always survives. Those words were now engraved on a plaque that would hang in the Clearwater Valley Memorial Museum. Because Emmeline had been right. The truth had survived. It had waited 77 years in darkness, protected by stone and silence and one woman's fierce determination. And when it finally emerged, it changed everything. Merrick and Opal understood now that they hadn't just found a treasure. They'd been chosen. Chosen by history, by circumstance, by an old key and a crumbling cabin and a woman who died before they were born. Chosen to be the voices for the voiceless, the witnesses for those who couldn't testify, the seekers of justice that had been too long delayed. It was a responsibility they'd never asked for, but it was one they'd embrace for the rest of their lives. The legal proceedings began in earnest that January. The federal courthouse became a second home for Merrick and Opal over the following months. They attended every hearing, every deposition, every procedural motion. Margot had warned them it would be grueling, and she hadn't exaggerated. The government strategy became clear quickly. They couldn't deny the fraud. The evidence was too overwhelming. Instead, they argued that too much time had passed, that pursuing restitution now would be administratively impossible and economically disruptive. They claimed that most of the original victims were deceased, that their descendants had no legal standing, that the Clearwater Valley project had been completed in good faith according to the standards of 1948. It was infuriating to watch. Lawyers in expensive suits arguing that justice had an expiration date, that crimes could be forgiven simply by running out the clock. But Margot was relentless. She'd assembled a team of volunteer attorneys, young idealists fresh from law school and seasoned veterans who remembered when the law was about right and wrong, not just procedure and precedent. They filed motions, submitted briefs, gathered evidence, and most importantly, they found the descendants. By March, they'd identified over 300 people directly descended from the 800 residents of Clearwater Valley. Some were elderly themselves now, children who'd been displaced as kids. Others were middle-aged or young, generations removed from the valley, but still carrying its legacy in their blood and their family stories. Margot organized them into a class action lawsuit. Martinez v. United States became the formal name, named after Rosa Martinez, who died in poverty in 1962. But everyone involved knew it represented something larger than one case, one family. It represented the principle that government doesn't get to cheat people just because those people eventually die. The breakthrough came in April during a deposition of a retired Bureau of Reclamation official named Albert Cromwell. He was 89 years old, his memory failing, but Margot's questions triggered something. He'd worked under Raymond Voss in 1948 as a junior clerk, and after 77 years of carrying the secret, he finally broke. "I knew what they were doing was wrong," Cromwell said, his voice shaking. "I was 23 years old, fresh out of college, and I watched them systematically undervalue every property in that valley. Mr. Voss had a formula. He'd take the independent appraisal, reduce it by 70 to 85%, and that became the government offer. When families complained, he'd threaten to reduce it further or condemn the property entirely and pay nothing." The deposition room went silent. Cromwell continued, tears rolling down his weathered face. "I saw him meet with county officials, saw money change hands, saw records altered. And when that schoolteacher, Miss Thatcher, started asking questions and collecting documents, I heard Mr. Voss on the telephone arranging for her to have an accident. He didn't say the words directly, but the meaning was clear. She was a problem that needed to disappear." "Did you report this to anyone?" Margot asked gently. Cromwell shook his head. "I was terrified. Mr. Voss made it clear that anyone who talked would be discredited or worse. So I stayed quiet. Got transferred to another project within 6 months. Spent my whole career trying to forget what I'd seen. But I never did forget. And when I saw the news about what those people found in that cabin, I knew it was time to tell the truth, even if I'm 77 years too late." His testimony was devastating to the government's case. Here was a direct witness, a government employee, confirming everything Emmeline's documents alleged. The Justice Department immediately offered a settlement conference. They wanted this to go away before it got worse. But the descendants, now organized and unified in a way their ancestors never had the chance to be, refused to settle quietly. They wanted public acknowledgement. They wanted the full truth exposed. They wanted their day in court. That day came in June. The federal courthouse in the state capital had never seen anything like it. Over 200 descendants traveled from across the country to attend. They filled the courtroom, the hallways, the steps outside. News crews from every major network set up cameras. This wasn't just a legal proceeding anymore. It was a moment of historical reckoning. Judge Morrison presided, her expression grave as she surveyed the packed courtroom. She'd spent months reviewing evidence, and everyone could see it had affected her. "Before we begin," she said, "I want to acknowledge what this case represents. This is not about money, though money is involved. This is not about property, though property was stolen. This is about whether our government is accountable for its actions, even actions taken generations ago. It's about whether justice delayed is justice denied, or justice that finally arrives." The government's attorneys presented their case first. They were professional, methodical, and utterly unconvincing. They argued procedure and jurisdiction and administrative feasibility. They talked about the Clearwater Dam project as if it had been a triumph of public works, bringing water and power to thousands of people. They mentioned the displaced families only in abstract terms, necessary sacrifices for the greater good. Then it was Margot's turn. She didn't start with legal arguments. She started with people. "Your Honor," she said, "I'd like to call witnesses. Not expert witnesses or government officials, just descendants who can tell you what the Clearwater Valley displacement cost their families." The first witness was William Harrison, now 84 years old. He walked slowly to the stand, steadied by a cane, and was sworn in. Margot asked him simple questions. "Tell us about your grandfather, Calvin Harrison." William's voice was soft but steady. My grandfather owned 160 acres in Clearwater Valley. He'd inherited it from his father, who'd homesteaded it in 1897. He grew wheat and barley, raised cattle, built a 3-story house with his own hands. He was a good man, a fair man, a man who believed in hard work and honesty. William paused, gathering himself. In 1947, government men came and told him his land was worth $900. He showed them appraisals proving it was worth $45,000. They told him take it or get nothing. When he tried to fight, they threatened him, said they'd condemn it and he wouldn't get a penny. So he took the $900 and moved his family to Billings. "What happened then?" Margot asked. William's eyes filled with tears. He tried to start over, but $900 doesn't buy much. He worked construction jobs, factory work, anything he could find. But he was a farmer at heart, and losing that land broke something in him. He died in 1959 at age 62. I was 17. The last thing he said to me was, "Tell them I didn't give up. Tell them they stole it. Make sure people know." William looked directly at Judge Morrison. "I'm telling you now, Your Honor. They stole it, and my grandfather deserved better. His children deserved better. We all deserved better." Margot called witness after witness. Patricia Chen, whose grandmother had owned a successful general store, appraised at $32,000, compensated with $650. She died in poverty, Patricia testified, working as a house cleaner until she was 78 because she had no retirement, no savings. The government took everything she'd built. A man named Robert Sullivan told how his great-uncle, a veteran of World War I, had been offered $500 for his property and died by suicide rather than accept it. He couldn't bear to lose what he'd fought to protect, Robert said quietly. A younger woman, maybe 35, named Jennifer Beckett, explained that her family had scattered after the displacement and lost touch. She'd only recently reconnected with cousins through the repository discovery. "We didn't even know each other existed," she said. "The government didn't just take our property, they destroyed our family structure, our community bonds, our sense of identity." The testimony went on for 3 days. Each story was unique, but the pattern was identical. Families cheated, lives disrupted, generational poverty created by systematic fraud. The courtroom was silent except for occasional weeping. Even the government attorneys looked uncomfortable. On the 4th day, Margot presented the documentary evidence. Emmeline's letters, the evidence files, the independent appraisals, the proof of bribes and kickbacks. She presented Albert Cromwell's deposition, his confession of witnessing fraud and murder conspiracy. She presented analysis showing that if the families had received fair compensation in 1948 and invested it conservatively, their descendants would collectively be worth over $200 million today. The government's attorneys tried to object, to argue, to deflect, but there was no defending the indefensible. Judge Morrison finally held up her hand. "I've heard enough," she said. "I'll issue my ruling in 30 days. Those 30 days felt like 30 years. Merrick and Opal returned to their cabin, trying to resume normal life, but nothing felt normal anymore. They'd become symbols of something larger than themselves. People stopped them in grocery stores to shake their hands. Letters arrived daily from across the country, thanking them, sharing stories, expressing hope that justice might still be possible. Iris's reporting had won multiple journalism awards. She'd written a book proposal about the Clearwater Valley story that publishers were fighting over. But she never forgot who'd made it possible. She visited the cabin regularly, bringing updates, sharing drafts, making sure Merrick and Opal's voices remained central to the narrative. Professor Ashcroft's team had completed their documentation of the chamber. Every item catalogued, photographed, researched. The historical value alone was incalculable. They'd uncovered details about daily life in Clearwater Valley that would have been lost forever otherwise. The repository wasn't just a treasure vault, It was a time capsule, a community's entire existence preserved in metal boxes and leather cases. Dalton Voss, meanwhile, had been indicted on 17 counts of corruption, fraud, and abuse of power. His trial was scheduled for September. His family's law firm had dissolved under the scandal. Properties they'd acquired through questionable condemnations were being reviewed. The Voss family legacy, built on 3 generations of theft, was crumbling. And in late July, Judge Morrison issued her ruling. It was 63 pages long, meticulously researched, powerfully written. Margot read it aloud to Merrick and Opal in their living room, her voice cracking with emotion. The ruling began with history. In 1948, the United States government, acting through the Bureau of Reclamation, displaced 800 residents of Clearwater Valley to construct a dam. Those residents were promised fair compensation and assistance with relocation. They received neither. Instead, they were subjected to a systematic scheme of fraud that reduced their compensation to approximately 15% of actual property values. Government officials profited personally from this fraud. Evidence was destroyed. A woman who attempted to document the crimes was murdered, her death disguised as an accident. Judge Morrison continued. For 77 years, this injustice remained hidden. The victims died carrying the burden of displacement and poverty. Their children inherited trauma and economic disadvantage. The government that was supposed to protect them instead betrayed them in the most fundamental way. Then came the legal findings. The court finds that the plaintiff class has established clear evidence of fraud, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. The court finds that the defendants, through their predecessors, engaged in systematic theft under color of law. The court finds that the statute of limitations does not apply because the fraud was actively concealed. The court finds that the descendants of the original victims have standing to pursue claims for restitution. Therefore, the court orders as follows. 1. The United States shall establish a restitution fund of $275 million to compensate descendants of Clearwater Valley families. This amount represents fair market value of the properties in 1948, adjusted for inflation and lost investment opportunity. 2. The repository items shall be returned to identified descendants according to Emmeline Thatcher's documentation. 3. The Clearwater Valley Memorial Museum shall receive federal funding to preserve this history. 4. The Department of Justice shall complete its criminal investigation into all officials involved in the fraud and murder conspiracy. 5. The government shall issue a formal apology acknowledging the crimes committed against the Clearwater Valley community. Margot's voice broke completely on that last point. She set down the ruling and looked at Merrick and Opal through tears. "You did it," she whispered. "You actually did it." Opal was sobbing. Merrick held her, his own eyes wet, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Judge Morrison had recognized. Not just the legal claims, but the human cost. The generational trauma, the lives derailed, the community destroyed, all of it acknowledged, validated, addressed. The news spread instantly. Within hours, descendants across the country were calling each other, crying, celebrating, processing. $275 million would be distributed among over 300 families. For some, it meant financial security for the first time in their lives. For others, it meant being able to retire, send kids to college, buy homes. But for all of them, it meant vindication. Their ancestors hadn't been wrong. Their family stories hadn't been exaggerated. The government really had stolen from them. And finally, justice was being served. The formal apology came in August. The Secretary of the Interior traveled to Ridgemont to deliver it personally. He stood in front of the future site of the Clearwater Valley Memorial Museum, surrounded by descendants, and read a statement that had been carefully crafted by lawyers but still carried weight. On behalf of the United States government, he said, I apologize for the crimes committed against the residents of Clearwater Valley. What happened in 1948 was not an unfortunate necessity of progress. It was theft. It was fraud. It was a violation of the most basic covenant between government and citizens. 800 people were systematically cheated. Their compensation was deliberately minimized. Their complaints were ignored. Their attempts to seek justice were suppressed. And when one woman, Emmeline Thatcher, tried to preserve evidence of these crimes, she was murdered. The crowd was absolutely silent. "We cannot undo the harm that was done," the secretary continued. "We cannot restore the valley that was flooded or return the decades that were lost. But we can acknowledge the truth. We can provide restitution. We can ensure this history is preserved and taught. And we can promise that the government will be held accountable for its actions, no matter how long ago they occurred." He paused, looking at the faces before him. "To the descendants of Clearwater Valley, you deserved better. Your parents and grandparents deserved better. And while justice delayed is not the justice they should have received, I hope it provides some measure of peace. Thank you for your patience, your perseverance, and your refusal to let this story remain buried." William Harrison stepped forward, now 85, and accepted the formal apology on behalf of all the families. His hands shook as he held the document, but his voice was strong. "My grandfather would have wanted two things," he said: "the truth and acknowledgement. Today, 77 years late, he gets both. I wish he'd lived to see it. But because of Merrick and Opal Holbrook, because of Emmeline Thatcher, because of everyone who refused to let this die, his story survives. And that matters more than anything." The museum construction accelerated after the settlement. Federal funding, combined with private donations, created a beautiful building on the edge of Ridgemont, overlooking the reservoir that covered the valley. The design was intentionally symbolic. Large windows faced the water, as if looking back through time. The entrance featured a sculpture of Emmeline Thatcher holding a book, representing her dedication to preserving truth through documentation. Inside, the museum told the complete story. Exhibits detailed life in Clearwater Valley before the dam. Photographs showed families, businesses, churches, schools. One entire wall displayed individual portraits of all 800 residents, each person named and acknowledged. This was not a footnote in history. These were human beings who mattered. Another section documented the dam project and the fraud. Visitors could read actual letters from bureau officials discussing how to minimize compensation. They could see the independent appraisals alongside the government offers, the discrepancy impossible to ignore. They could watch video testimony from descendants explaining what the theft had cost their families. The centerpiece was the Emmeline Thatcher Memorial Room. Here, her letters were displayed behind protective glass. Visitors could read her words, follow her growing alarm, understand her determination. Photographs showed her as a young teacher, surrounded by students. Documents revealed her methodical creation of the repository. And in the center of the room, mounted on a pedestal, was her final journal entry, the one where she'd written that the truth always survives. But the room that affected people most powerfully was the last one. The reunion room, they called it. Here, items from the repository were displayed, along with photographs of the descendants who'd reclaimed them. A silver brush set returned to Rosa Martinez's granddaughter. A violin reunited with a musician who'd never known his great-grandfather played. Gold coins divided among siblings who'd met for the first time through this process. Each item had a story. Each return had healed something broken. Interactive displays allowed visitors to search databases of Clearwater Valley families, learning about individual residents and their fates. Touchscreens showed family trees, connecting modern descendants to their valley ancestors. There were listening stations where people could hear oral histories, descendants sharing stories passed down through generations. The museum opened in October, 18 months after Merrick and Opal had first opened the metal box behind their fireplace. The dedication ceremony drew over 1,000 people. Descendants came from across the country. Government officials attended, looking appropriately somber. Journalists covered it extensively. But the focus remained on the families and on the woman who'd made it all possible. A string quartet played music from 1948. Speakers shared memories and reflections. Children who'd grown up hearing about Clearwater Valley now walked through exhibits showing it had been real. Elderly survivors of the displacement, now in their 80s and 90s, wept at seeing their childhood home acknowledged and honored. Merrick and Opal were asked to cut the ceremonial ribbon. They stood at the entrance, surrounded by descendants who'd become friends, holding oversized scissors they could barely lift. When the ribbon fell away and the doors opened, the crowd surged forward, eager to witness history that had almost been lost. Inside, Opal found herself standing in front of Emmeline's portrait. She stared at the intelligent eyes, the determined expression, and felt a connection across 77 years. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for not giving up." Merrick joined her, slipping his hand into hers. "She didn't give up," he said quietly, "and neither did you." The impact of the Clearwater Valley story extended far beyond the museum and the settlement. It sparked a national conversation about government accountability and historical injustices. Other communities came forward with similar stories. Native American tribes, African American families displaced by highway construction, farmers forced out by military base expansions, all began demanding the same kind of reckoning. The Justice Department created a special unit to investigate historical fraud cases. Congress held hearings about reforming eminent domain laws. Law schools developed curricula around the case. Martinez v. United States became required reading for government attorneys, a reminder that some wrongs demand correction regardless of how much time has passed. But for Merrick and Opal, life gradually returned to something resembling normal. The media attention faded. The constant stream of visitors slowed to occasional tourists who'd heard about their story. They could once again sit on their deck with morning coffee, watching the valley below, enjoying the peace they'd fought so hard to protect. Their cabin became exactly what they'd always wanted it to be: a home. The chamber beneath remained sealed, its contents now in the museum or returned to families. They'd kept the hearthstone mechanism as a reminder, but the space below was empty now, its purpose fulfilled. They received letters constantly from descendants. Thank you notes, updates on how settlement money had changed lives, invitations to family reunions they'd somehow become honorary members of. William Harrison visited quarterly, always bringing fresh flowers to place at Emmeline's memorial. Patricia Chen sent Christmas cards showing her children and grandchildren, generations that would grow up financially secure because of justice finally served. And they received letters from strangers too, people inspired by their story. A woman in Ohio who'd started investigating why her grandmother lost family land in the 1960s. A man in Texas questioning a convenient condemnation of his property. Ordinary people learning that they didn't have to accept injustice just because officials said it was legal. One evening in late autumn, as the first snow began to fall on Pine Bluff, Merrick and Opal sat together in their living room. The fire crackled in the hearth that had once hidden the repository. Photographs from the museum dedication sat on the mantel. Life felt full in a way it never had before. Opal picked up a letter that had arrived that morning. It was from a teenage girl in Montana, Jennifer Martinez, descended from Rosa Martinez, whose family had lost the general store. She wrote, "My history teacher assigned us to research our family history. I told her about Clearwater Valley and what happened to my great-great-grandmother. She asked me to present it to the class. I was nervous, but I showed them the letters and the evidence and explained how you found it all. When I finished, everyone was quiet. Then my teacher said, 'This is why history matters. This is why truth matters. This is why we don't give up on justice.' and I realized my great-great-grandmother Rosa, who died sad and poor, her story is now teaching other kids that their voices matter. That's because of you. Thank you for caring about people you never met. Thank you for finishing what Emmeline started. You changed my family's story from one of loss to one of justice. That means everything." Opal read the letter aloud to Merrick, her voice breaking on the last lines. He took her hand, squeezing gently. "We didn't change anything," he said. "We just refused to ignore what we found. Emmeline did the hard part. She built the case, preserved the evidence, sacrificed everything. But without us," Opal said, "it would have stayed buried. Sometimes the hard part is just showing up, just being in the right place and making the right choice." They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from 49 years of marriage and shared purpose. Outside, snow continued falling, blanketing the world in white. Inside, the fire warmed them. The photographs reminded them of what they'd accomplished, and the letters proved it had mattered. "Anyone can change the world if they're brave enough to tell the truth when silence would be easier," Merrick said quietly. Emmeline proved that. And maybe we did too. The museum thrived in the months that followed. Thousands of visitors came annually, drawn by the story of justice delayed but not denied. School groups toured regularly, learning about government accountability and the power of documentation. Researchers used the archives to study Depression-era economics and post-war development projects. But the museum's greatest impact was personal. Families continued to discover connections to Clearwater Valley. Genealogists helped people trace their ancestry, revealing valley roots they'd never known existed. These newly identified descendants would visit the museum, see their ancestors' portrait on the wall of 800, and feel a piece of their identity click into place. The restitution payments changed lives in tangible ways. William Harrison used his portion to establish a scholarship fund for students studying American history and social justice. Patricia Chen bought the house her grandmother had always dreamed of owning. Robert Sullivan, whose great-uncle had died rather than accept the inadequate payment, donated to veterans' organizations in his ancestors' name. But more than money, the families gained something invaluable. They gained the knowledge that their ancestors hadn't failed, hadn't been weak, hadn't deserved what happened. They'd been victims of systematic fraud, and now, finally, that truth was recognized. Dalton Voss was convicted on 14 of 17 counts in September. He was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution of over $4 million, representing his family's profits from decades of fraudulent property acquisitions. His father's estate was also subjected to civil forfeiture. The Voss family name, once powerful in county politics, was now synonymous with corruption. And the criminal investigation into Raymond Voss, though he'd been dead for 32 years, resulted in a formal finding. The Attorney General's office concluded that Emmeline Thatcher's death was indeed murder, arranged by Raymond Voss to prevent exposure of his crimes. Her death certificate was officially amended. Cause of death now read homicide by drowning, victim of government conspiracy. It was a small change, but it mattered. It acknowledged that she hadn't died carelessly. She'd died fighting. On April 16th, the anniversary of Emmeline's death, the museum held an annual memorial service. Descendants gathered to honor her and all the Clearwater Valley residents. Merrick and Opal always attended, standing quietly in the back, watching as a community reassembled itself around shared history and collective healing. This year, the 5th anniversary of the museum's opening, William Harrison asked Merrick to speak. Merrick had always deflected such requests, insisting he was just a retired engineer who'd gotten lucky. But William was persistent. "You're part of this story now," he said. "You and Opal, you deserve to be heard." So Merrick stood before a crowd of over 300 people and tried to find words for what he'd experienced. "I'm 78 years old," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I've built bridges and roads. I've seen structures rise from nothing. I thought I understood what it meant to build something lasting. But what Opal and I stumbled into, what we helped uncover, that's taught me something different about legacy." He paused, looking at Opal in the front row. She smiled encouragement. "We didn't set out to be heroes or activists or historical figures. We just wanted to save our home. But sometimes doing the right thing in your own backyard ripples outward in ways you never imagine." Emmeline Thatcher knew that. She couldn't save Clearwater Valley from being flooded, but she could save its story from being erased. She couldn't prevent the fraud, but she could preserve evidence of it. She worked in the dark, literally and figuratively, trusting that someday someone would find what she'd hidden and understand what it meant. Merrick's voice grew stronger. "We were those someones. And what we learned is this: justice doesn't have an expiration date. Truth doesn't stop mattering just because time passes. The people who were wronged 77 years ago, they're gone. But their children and grandchildren are here, and they deserve to know what really happened. They deserve to have their family stories validated. They deserved justice, even if it came generations late." He looked around at the faces before him, young and old, connected by blood to a place that no longer existed except in memory and documentation. "This museum isn't just about the past," he said. "It's about the future. It's about teaching new generations that their voices matter, that standing up to power is possible, that ordinary people can change the course of history if they're willing to try." Emmeline was ordinary, a schoolteacher in a small mountain town, but she was extraordinary in her courage and her conviction. And if an old mechanic and a retired librarian could help finish what she started, then anyone can make a difference. The audience rose in a standing ovation. Merrick, uncomfortable with the attention, quickly returned to his seat beside Opal. But the words he'd spoken resonated, because they were true. Ordinary people, given the chance and the courage, could achieve extraordinary things. The years that followed were the richest of Merrick and Opal's lives. Not in wealth, though the various legal proceedings eventually resulted in them receiving a finder's fee that made their retirement comfortable, but rich in meaning, in purpose, in relationships formed through shared commitment to justice. They became advisors to other communities investigating historical injustices. They spoke at universities about the importance of documentation and preservation. They consulted with historians researching Depression-era government programs. They answered hundreds of letters from people who'd been inspired by their story. But mostly, they lived. They tended Opal's wildflower garden, which had expanded to cover much of their property. They took morning walks along the cliff edge, the same route Emmeline had probably walked while planning the repository. They hosted descendants who wanted to see where it all began, serving coffee and sharing stories on the deck, where Merrick had first spotted Dalton Voss's truck approaching. And they visited the museum regularly, never as celebrities but as witnesses. They'd sit quietly in the Emmeline Thatcher Memorial Room, reading letters they'd read dozens of times before, always finding something new to appreciate in her careful words and determined planning. One spring afternoon, 5 years after the museum opened, Opal sat on a bench in the reunion room, watching a family examine items that had been returned to them. A mother and her 3 children were looking at a collection of photographs that had belonged to their great-great-grandfather. The children, maybe 8 to 12 years old, were completely engaged, asking questions, tracing family resemblances, making connections between past and present. The mother noticed Opal watching and approached. "Are you Mrs. Holbrook?" she asked. Opal nodded. The woman's eyes filled with tears. "I'm Anna Sullivan," she said. "My great-great-uncle was the veteran who died rather than accept the government's payment. We never knew why. We just knew he'd taken his own life and the family didn't talk about it. Finding out the truth, understanding what he faced, it's changed how we see him. He wasn't weak, he was heartbroken. And knowing that, being able to explain it to my children, that's helped us heal something we didn't even know was broken." She grasped Opal's hand. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for caring enough to fight." Opal hugged her, this stranger who felt like family, connected by history and healing. "That's what it's about," she said softly. "Not the money or the fame or even the justice, really. It's about giving people back their stories, helping them understand where they came from. That's what Emmeline wanted. That's what we tried to honor." Merrick joined them, and Anna introduced her children. They shook hands solemnly, these young people meeting the elderly couple who'd uncovered their family history. The youngest child, a girl maybe 8 years old, looked up at Merrick with wide eyes. "Did you really find buried treasure?" she asked. Merrick knelt down to her level. "We found something better than treasure," he said. "We found the truth, and sometimes that's worth more than all the gold in the world." The little girl considered this seriously. "My teacher says truth is important." "Your teacher is right," Merrick said. "And you know what else? You're part of a story that proves truth wins, even when it takes a really long time." As the Sullivan family moved on to other exhibits, Merrick and Opal stood together, watching visitors engage with history that had almost been lost. They were 83 and 81 now, both feeling their age in aching joints and slower movements. But they'd never felt more alive, more purposeful, more certain that their lives had mattered. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories are waiting for you. Click to keep discovering. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe the truth deserves a voice.